Hello and welcome to the second in our Brexit webinar series. We're very excited for everybody that's joined and thank you so much for coming around for the second week. I'm going to introduce you to our experts today. We have Adrian Jones in the United Kingdom, we have Martyn Fiddler in Ireland, and we have Martyn Kenyuk in the Isle of Man. Last week, we spoke about analysing your options for Brexit and how to get prepared by getting your team together, looking at the documentation, and really making sure you know the ownership and use of the aircraft and how that's changed over time. If you missed last week's webinar, please check out our website, where is a recording and a summary of that. The website is martynfiddler.aero. So this week, we're going to be talking your business jet blueprint for Brexit. So we're going to be analysing various options available for importation into the EU and the UK, and we'll be talking about how to optimise your choices in choosing the perfect solution for you. Next week, we will be doing a deep dive into temporary admission and the Netherlands Navigator. So we'll be going into a lot of detail in next week's session. This week, it will be more of an overview of the various importation solutions. We're going to have polls going throughout the webinar, so please do participate in those and please keep the questions coming too. We've answered, or at least we've tried to answer, every question that we've received after last week's webinar, so keep them coming in. If we can't get to it today, we will answer it after the session. So I'm going to launch that polling now. And today we are going to be talking a lot about importation. So it would be useful to start off with what importation actually means. Adrian, can you give us a summary of that?
Yes, sure. Importation, that's something that every good or every item, every aircraft that enters a customs territory, in this case it could be the EU or the UK as distinct from the EU after the separation at the end of this year, every item that enters that customs territory should be declared to customs, should be imported, and any customs duty and VAT paid. Fortunately, on civilian aircraft, there isn't any customs duty, but VAT should be paid at that point. And the choice is typically binary. Either you import or you have a reason not to. So temporary admission would be the obvious choice for aircraft, and that's something, as Heather says, we're discussing next week. Imports, in comparison to temporary admission, are often described as permanent imports or full imports. The truth of it is, it's an import as opposed to not being imported. And you should remember that actually import status can, in certain circumstances, be lost. For example, if an aircraft is outside of the EU for more than 3 years, for example, that import status could be lost. If ownership or control of the aircraft is transferred outside of the EU, then again, that import status can be lost. So permanent import, not always permanent, but definitely not temporary, as in temporary admission.
Great, thank you, Adrian. So last week we were speaking about how we anticipated a decision on whether there'd be a deal or no deal would have happened because they set the deadline the 31st of October. That has come and gone. Are we any closer to having a decision or knowing anything, Adrian?
Well, sadly, no. This weekend, the news has all been about the lockdown in the UK and the trade negotiations. The last that I can see that happened is that the UK agreed a trade deal with Japan. Boris announced that trade deal with the EU was off, and then the EU decided to, I think, take negotiations more seriously, come back to the table with renewed vigor. But since then, we've heard nothing more. So whilst I would like to think there was some deal to be had, it may not go as far as include aviation specifically. Business jets perhaps less so. So we can hope for the best, but I think realistically prepare for the worst at the moment.
Excellent. So everything is as clear as mud then. So using our best skills and what we know, what do we think the two new zones will look like in terms of VAT and customs? Martyn, can I ask you that?
Yeah, so it's kind of simple, really. There's going to be two completely separate areas. So the border of the EU is going to shrink a little bit. There'll be an outline where the UK used to be, and they'll both have their own customs and VAT arrangements. And where you used to be able to import in the UK and then have free circulation into Europe, that'll disappear. And similarly, now when you import, or next year when you import into the UK or the EU, you won't have automatic rights into the other jurisdictions. So you're going to need, for all of the aircraft, you're going to need to look at how do we operate, how can we move between and in each of those jurisdictions if actually your flying is within and between those jurisdictions.
Okay, so we're going to get on to talking about the range of importation solutions that are available in the new EU27 and in the UK after the 1st of January. But before we get there, I think it's worth addressing a question which we've been asked on a fairly regular basis, which is, am I allowed to save tax? Martyn, can I come back to you on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, the short answer for that really is that everybody should be paying the appropriate amount of tax. It's perfectly legal for a company or individual to mitigate the amount of tax that they pay, but that's it, mitigating, planning. But when you get into evasion, things like that, that's completely illegal. So in this kind of context, what we always say to people is talk to us about what you actually do, what your flying is actually going to be, and then let's see which of the solutions, which of the options is going to be best for you, rather than the other way around of saying, here's a range, why don't you pick one and we'll try and make the facts fit it. That isn't the way that it's done. So like we were saying last week about getting out the paperwork, talking to people in your team about what does the future look like? What do I need it to achieve? What are we actually doing with the aircraft? That's what people need to be thinking about, is what is the real world situation and what can I do in that real world situation?
Thank you. So returning to looking at our two zones, my understanding is that on the 1st of January, if you had previously been imported into the European Union via the UK, you will lose your free circulation status in the new EU27. Angie, can you talk us through the options available to aircraft owners who are facing this dilemma?
Yes, of course. I'm going to talk about business aircraft, not private aircraft, or those operated for totally private business purposes, rather. Martyn can touch on that later on. But there are a number of solutions available. If you're imported into the UK and no longer EU free circulation, you need to be imported back into the EU. One way of doing that is to have a VAT ownership solution within an EU member state, for example, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, Cyprus, etc. You may be eligible to use temporary admission within the EU27 as opposed to having to be fully imported. We'll cover off temporary admission next week in quite a bit of detail. You may be able to do a one-off importation using fiscal representation services, and some operators, or some owners rather, might prefer to actually put their aircraft onto an AOC commercial operation. It's important though to remember no one size fits all. There's no such thing as one solution that will fit, John and Fred, etc. They're all different. So it's very important to understand, or to review rather, and get the optimum solution for your own particular scenario, for your client scenario. It's also very important to understand that there are different VAT implications in various member states. You have to understand how VAT is treated, etc. And it's also as I said, very important that each client scenario is absolutely reviewed to find the best solution for them.
Thank you. So you mentioned there that VAT is treated differently in the various jurisdictions within the EU. My understanding is that each jurisdiction within the EU zone has to apply VAT. Adrian, can you talk us through why it's not uniform?
Yes, certainly. If you look at the two taxes that we have to consider as applying to aircraft that arrive into the EU for import, one is customs duty, customs importation, customs duty, and the other one is VAT. Now, customs rules are provided for in the EU by an EU regulation, which is immediately law in every member state. So that law is uniform. By comparison, VAT is governed by a VAT directive. Now, that directive then has to be enacted into national law in each EU member state, each EU country. And there are differences in the way that law is enacted. There are larger differences, if you like, or more differences to be found in some of the older member states of the EU, France, Germany, Italy. Some of the newer member states have taken the directive and simply applied it directly into their law, same wording. But there are variations. One of the key variations, of course, is the VAT rate. VAT rates vary, and they range from, at the moment, 17%, say, in Luxembourg, through to 27% in Hungary. There are many countries have an average, have their rates around the average of around 21, 22%. There's a set minimum of 15 in law as a standard rate. There are reduced rates as well, but the minimum standard rate is 15, although the minimum actual rate is 17 at the moment. But there's no cap on what the highest rate could be. So presumably at some point, with the difficulties economically at the moment, rates could increase from 27 to 28 or 29 perhaps.
Thank you, Adrian. So that's got a comprehensive look at the EU 27. So let's flip that and say if prior to the 1st of January you've been imported into the European Union via one of the EU 27 countries, then you're going to lose your free circulation status in the UK area. Martyn, can you talk us through the options that are available to aircraft owners there?
Yeah, so it's very similar to what Angie was saying about the other jurisdiction. You've got temporary admission. Angie said that we're going to be talking about that next week. And then you've got importation, whether we're going to call it full importation or permanent importation. The importation, really, for that, what you're looking about is having a VAT registered company. So there's you could have a company that's already within your VAT group and you're going to deal with the VAT through that company. You might create a VAT registered SPV in the jurisdiction, or you might want to put the aircraft onto an AOC if that's the way that you're flying. And then the way that VAT will be dealt with by those different companies, there's the option to pay and reclaim the VAT. There's also the option to use a deferment account. So you're deferring paying the VAT until a later date. And then it's normal that you'd couple that with a reclaim before that date for the VAT. So there wasn't actually any VAT money being passed over to the government. And then, of course, if you're on an AOC, there is zero rating the import. If it's a qualifying aircraft, you can do that. So there's a range of options. And of course, you could always pay the VAT.
So both you and Angie specifically carved out private pleasure use of the aircraft from your overview of the options. Can you talk me through what options are available for aircraft that fall into that category?
Yeah, sure. So like we mentioned last week, VAT is a consumer tax. So the end consumer is going to pay it. So if it's a private aircraft being used for pleasure purposes, just like any other kind of vehicle, then the consumer, the owner, would pay the VAT in their own jurisdiction, whether that was in the UK or in the EU. But then if they're going to take it to the other jurisdiction, what they could do is they could use temporary admission when they're taking it across. So it's absolutely fine. And just to say that we have over the years imported aircraft Martyn Fiddler, Angie's office, where people have paid the VAT, and they tend to be smaller aircraft, GA aircraft, as opposed to business aircraft, but we have done it.
Thank you, Martyn. So I'm going to try a little bit of a Blue Peter. Here's one I created earlier exercise now, and I'm going to share my screen with everybody. So we've put together an overview of the range of solutions that we've spoken about in today's webinar. You don't need to scribble this down. We will send it to everybody that registered after the webinar, so we will be sharing this with you. But while you're taking a quick look at that, Angie, a quick question from our audience, which is, can I use multiple solutions at the same time?
Well, the answer to that is yes, but when we're talking about the UK and the EU, you can't do that until January 2021. You can't be, I'll use the word imported, in one customs region more than once. So if you are looking at, if you are imported, again, as we mentioned earlier, in the UK, and you will be after the year end, you may be able to use temporary admission in the EU after January, and vice versa. So the answer is yes. Import and import, temporary admission and import, import and temporary admission, depending on where you are. Not until January.
Thank you very much, Angie. I'm going to give you a couple of extra moments on the first polling question, which is, where are you at with your preparations for Brexit? In the meantime, we spoke a lot last week about preparation and how to get ready, how to look at how the aircraft is being used, how it is owned. We've just spoken about the various options that may be available to aircraft owners. Adrian, how do you start using that preparation and looking at the options to narrow it down to what is going to be the optimal solution, or perhaps solutions for the aircraft?
Well, I would always recommend getting good tax advice when doing this analysis, but then I'm a tax advisor, so I guess you'd expect that. There can be a number of options, or there can be one obvious way forward for any particular set of circumstances. I think it always pays to have a good look at the criteria that might determine which options to consider more fully, which options to follow. You need to look at a basket of things: the registration of the aircraft, legal ownership of the aircraft. I mean, these can be changed, but that's awkward. You'd rather build a solution around the actual circumstances. I think you need to look at where the aircraft were imported, where it has its fiscal base, where the VAT is accounted for is particularly important, but also where it's going to be used in the future, where the current owner or the main user, the ultimate owner, resides. Is that in the 27, one of the 27 remainder states in Europe or the UK? And once you've looked at those criteria, then you can narrow down your options as to which is the best way forward. Having said all that, an obvious thing to do would be to try and keep things as simple as possible, not create a tremendously large tax solution or import solution to build something complex when you don't need to. Try and keep it simple could be a good watchword. Yeah. Right.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm just going to end that poll, the first poll, right now and share the results with you. So it is looking like most people have done their preparation work. Fantastic. And they are aware of most of the options, but haven't quite chosen their optimal one yet. So on the basis we're talking about that at the moment, Adrian, if you've narrowed your options down and you've got some favoured ones, are there any restrictions that might stop you from choosing one over another?
Well, there are 2 or 3 red lines, if you like, where I would urge caution. The obvious one that Martyn touched on before is evasion. Anything that's illegal is called evasion for tax purposes, and obviously you want to stay very clear of that. Then you have avoidance. Now, avoidance is where you pay strictly the legal amount of tax, but you avoid paying any more than you absolutely need to. And governments have become increasingly frustrated about avoidance, whilst you're not obliged to pay any more tax than you absolutely should. This goes back to what I said about overcomplicating things. So now there is a concept of abuse, which, if you like, is a third red line, and you want to avoid abuse. This is where you put in too many transactions or elements in a solution which are designed to save tax primarily, and frankly, not much else. And there are powers now that tax authorities have to recharacterize those arrangements and redress any tax that has been saved. So again, look at the reality, try and match whatever solution you're preparing to the reality of the client's circumstances, the use of the aircraft, and the criteria that I mentioned earlier. Build it, don't let the tax drive the process.
So we want something which is authentic in its nature. So one of the situations we've faced before is where the team looking at the aircraft and the importation have chosen a suboptimal solution simply because there is a timing issue. They haven't prepared enough in advance. They're getting pressure from the aircraft owner. So they've gone for not the optimal solution, simply on a timing basis. Angie, can you talk us through the dangers of doing this?
Well, the danger of basically plumping for not the optimum solution for the second best due to the fact it takes longer or whatever, it's very short-sighted, to be perfectly honest, and potentially could leave the client with other problems to deal with. So again, as I've said, I suppose I keep banging on about it, no one size fits all. It's something that you've got to be, the team that you've got around you need to review your particular scenario to get the most appropriate solution for you, for your client. Do it sooner rather than later, so there's no mad rush at the end of it if it's required. And if you think about it, it's time taken now to review and to look at the solutions that might be available. They may take the solution that's best for you might take some time to put in place. And you need to have that time to review everything. If you, for instance, need an EU VAT registration to be put in place, that can take a few weeks to do, as we said previously. The other thing is that, as Adrian mentioned at the beginning, you should be planning for the worst and hoping for the best. In the best case scenario, the only downside I can see is that an owner may have incurred costs through their advisor and then not need to have to make a solution after all. But the downside, or the worst case scenario, and we have got to deal with a second solution, that solution will already be in place and ready to go as soon as it's possible to put in place in 2021 if the planning is done now and done correctly. And the other thing people have got to consider, you've got to allow time for your service providers to put solutions in place for you. So no matter what that is, they've got to be able to put the plan in action for you. Simple as that.
Great advice. Thank you, Angie. I've opened the second poll, so please get voting on that. We're going to repeat a section that we did last week. So fact, fiction or fantasy, busting those aviation tax myths. The first one that we've received, we've received some questions on this. I think I'm going to point it at Angie. My aircraft is on an AOC, presumably I'm okay.
Don't presume. Simple as that. Don't presume. You have got to worry. You're not necessarily going to be okay. You should be, your operator, your AOC operator should have a plan of action in place. He or she needs to ensure that you're in free circulation in the jurisdictions that you are operating in. Don't ever presume.
I've got another one here for you, Angie. The question is, I have declared my aircraft into maintenance. Do I have free circulation?
Short answer, no, absolutely not. I'm always shouting at the team about this, I'm sorry, but in 99.9% of the time, if you've been declared in for maintenance, you've been declared under a temporary regime known as inward processing. That is not free circulation. That is a tax suspension regime. This is something that we have encountered on a number of occasions, and there's always a presumption that by declaring goods to customs, that they're declared to a regime that gives you free circulation. It's not true, it's not automatic.
Thank you, Angie. I feel you enjoyed that a little bit too much there. So another question that is quite popular. My aircraft is registered in the European Union. It has an ownership vehicle which is also in the European Union. Does that mean I get automatic VAT registration? Martyn, I'm going to put that one to you.
Possibly in the words of Angie, no. No, an aircraft registration doesn't give any kind of VAT registration with it. If you talk to anybody who runs an aircraft registry, they'll say this is one of their biggest, I think, kind of bugbears, is that there seems to be a misunderstanding or a conflation between aircraft registration and VAT registration. And there isn't an automatic thing, just exactly the same way that if you registered a company that owned an aircraft for VAT in a jurisdiction, you wouldn't automatically get an aircraft registration in that jurisdiction. The two things are different. You know, we have companies, Ireland, UK, Isle of Man, etc., that will own aircraft. They don't have to be from that jurisdiction. So an Isle of Man company doesn't have to own an Isle of Man registered aircraft. So there is that. I suppose there isn't probably. I can understand why people make that mistake, but it's definitely a mistake, and I really wouldn't count on it at all.
Okay, a similar question, same situation. If an aircraft's imported into, if an aircraft is registered in the EU, does it get free circulation in the EU?
Oh, okay. So a very similar answer is no. So if you looked at, again, I'll just take the example of the Isle of Man at the moment. You could have companies or people in the EU, but also the British Commonwealth. So you could have an Isle of Man aircraft owned by an Australian company. That wouldn't give them any kind of automatic situation in, say, the UK or the EU or anything. Again, they're just very different. An aircraft registration is exactly that. It's a registration for an aircraft. Nothing to do with its customs situation, nothing to do with its VAT situation at all. So please don't make that mistake because the two are not automatically linked at all.
Thank you, Martyn. We've got about 2 minutes remaining. So one last question that we've had in. If I've got temporary admission, does that mean I can make multiple return trips from the US to the EU? Adrian, can I point that one at you?
Yes, well, temporary admission starts and stops every time you enter customs territory. So if you qualify for temporary admission on one journey, then presumably you should qualify on the next. But they're separate periods of temporary admission, not one continuous period. There is a time limit for one entry of 6 months, but if you're making multiple trips, that wouldn't normally apply.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm going to end the polling just very shortly, but summing up today, we've learned nothing new from the EU and the UK. We know that there will be 2 new VAT and customs zones, the EU 27 and the UK. We've learnt that there's various options to assist aircraft owners in both of those 2 new zones, but not all solutions will be optimal, and you need to have done your preparation, you need to analyse your options and go for a solution which is authentic to the use and the ownership of the aircraft rather than something that's artificial and very complicated. So let me end the polling now. I'm going to share the results to you. I love the fact that one person has decided they're going to go on the advice from their pilot. That's brilliant. I'm rather pleased that quite a few people do understand which options and which are best for the aircraft. For those of you that are swinging between a couple and are looking for other options, do not hesitate to get in contact with us. We will be sharing the flowchart that I put up earlier. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. We know that most of you have given up part of your lunch break to do this. We've tried to keep to time, keep the questions coming in. If you've got any questions after today's session, just email us. We will try our best to answer. And if you've got any questions for next week, where we'll be doing a deep dive into temporary admission and the Netherlands Navigator, send those in so we can focus on what your concerns are. That's it from us. Thank you to you all. Keep well and stay safe.